Hello, friends. Welcome to this special session of our forum. I know you all, so I don't need to introduce myself. We are so glad to have Paul Nelson here with us. He has just written a book. How about a hand for Paul? His writing a book is no small feat. And he's going to share some of that and things about better health for America, which is a very important thing. I'm going to turn it over to Paul. I invite you all to hit mute for the first part, but there will be dialogue later to unmute yourself for. But if you could all mute yourselves to make this video focus on Paul, that'd be cool. I will spotlight him as well. All right, Paul, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. And thanks, Katie, for the invitation to talk about better health for America. And my only proviso is that in writing the book, there's a lot that we don't know, frankly. And but there are some things that are known and knowable that sort of taking a new view at that we might make some sense of all this. So this is about maybe laying some groundwork and then inviting a substantial part of our time to talk about questions that you might have about how things are now, because I think we have to start with where we're at and think of new ways to reconfigure our future. So got into this as a physician, going to medical school here in Omaha, then ended up with a first year of residency at Harlem Hospital, of all things, in New York City for a year, 1969. And then that was in internal medicine. And then there was a year of pediatrics at the University of Minnesota, at which I finally figured that I didn't really have a neck for academic medicine and research. So I returned to Omaha for a couple of years of finishing pediatric training. Then in the Army for a couple of years as a physician, and that was a military obligation from back in 1960, graduate from high school. So otherwise, I've been in Omaha since 1975, and I married a person I met through working on the old Judge Hart juvenile court judge recall campaign back in 1973. Does that sound right, Nikki? Anyway, I have two daughters who survived, and my wife suddenly died about 18 years ago one day, and sort of, I think, a congenital defect. But anyway, it's been a wonderful sort of experience over the years in spite of all the drawbacks and things that have happened. So here I am, having retired 4 years ago, having started a hobby around 1999, maybe 2000, to write myself short essays about a better understanding of why things are really not going very well. And so after having accumulated approximately 45 of these essays, it was time to see if I could put it together. And so be it, I'm happy to run into Luther McNaughton, and he volunteered, of all things, to help me transfer it into a book. And I owe a lot to Luther and this whole process. So anybody know Luther? He's quite a character. Yeah, good. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe before we get into an opportunity to have some dialogue, I want to remind you of some things that are kind of alarming. Our nation has had worsening maternal mortality incidents since 1970. It has worsened every year. The only developed country in the world to do that. And the reasons for that are not totally understood, but it isn't really a fault of the healthcare system, I don't think, although there are some elements that contribute to that. There are other fundamental issues in how our social fabric has evolved over the last 50 years that have contributed to that, and that's my opinion. And if for the last 10 years, our nation's longevity has not improved, unlike all of the other developed countries of the world. And we have worsening experiences of adverse childhood experiences called ACEs, or otherwise known as childhood maltreatment. Worsening childhood or pre-adolescent obesity, worsening levels of homicide, suicide, and substance abuse amongst our adolescent population, worsening homelessness, and an unusual phenomena of midlife mortality labeled as midlife experience of despair, very often related to our lack of, for certain populations, social mobility. And social mobility is a term meaning that people who grow up in one socioeconomic status are able to achieve a higher level of socioeconomic status as an adult. So that's our fundamental view of our nation's overall level of health. So with this in mind, I think there are two underlying themes. One is the humanitarian theme, and the other is the scientific theme. And some of you may recall a series of lectures given by a person by the name of C.P. Snow in 1957 that first sort of dramatized this. Anybody read his lectures? No. But there is this sort of disconnect between the reductionism of science. In other words, the progress we've made in understanding at more fundamental levels exactly what's going on. And of course, there's this thought that genetics will eventually solve all of the causes and potential treatment for all the things that afflict us during the lifetime. And it turns out that the reductionism will really not achieve that. I mean, there are so many things which are affected by our social fabric. And one new idea that I'll just allow you, and that is the concept of epigenetics. And this is related to the fact that at the time of conception, when the sperm and the ovum unite to form a potentially new person, the resultant cytoplasm comes totally from the female ovum. The sperm contributes no cytoplasm, which is the working atmosphere in which the genetics are able to work through and create the expression of human life. And this phenomenon of epigenetics probably is affected by particularly the processes of conception, the humanitarian status of the woman prior to and during the gestational part of the pregnancy. And so we now have statistics that can relate neighborhood poverty and adverse living conditions prior to a woman's pregnancy and the health of the child later on, particularly during adolescence, and inability during adolescence to cope with the social circumstances of that age. And so consequently, suicide, drug abuse, homicide are probably all have been shown to be related to the adverse events that a woman is experiencing prior to the pregnancy. And actually the data for that now exists. So that's the humanitarian side of all this. And I would say the other phenomenon I think that's really key here is how we go about working together to solve the problems of daily life. And the general term that's used for that is social cohesion. So it's our anticipation that the people that we encounter in life are trustworthy, particularly as we encounter people who don't live in our community. So it's our national level of social cohesion. And it allows us then to work together to solve potentially the basically the social determinants of health. So so I thought with that background, kind of humanitarian scientific duality here, I'm hopefully that I can get through the rest of my presentation quickly so we can open up some questions. So if you have some things about your own observations, I'm going to allow Katie to moderate that. And there are certain questions I don't have the answers for. So I'm going to be real blunt if I don't have the answers for that. And also to, if we have interchange, to limit it so that we have opportunity we can do this all together. And I'm going to depend on Katie as well as myself to moderate that. So let me just say finally that the humanitarian character of human life has its origins pretty recently in terms of, the Big Bang for our universe occurred, about 14, 15 billion years ago. And our own solar system has its origins about 5 billion years ago. And the onset of life forms probably somewhere around 400 or 500 billion years ago. And out of that whole sequence, the origins of human life as we know it were probably around 50 to 100,000 years ago. Pretty recent in terms of the cosmology of our universe. And the origins 50 to 100,000 years ago are individuals who had the early sentient feeling, reflective ability to analyze situations, cognitive capabilities that we now share. So, and sort of recorded history. I don't, maybe, Jim, you have a sense of recorded history, maybe what, since 5,000 BC, does that sound right, or less than that? Well, anyway, so we live in the grand scheme of things in a very changing time. So in the last 50, 100,000 years, people survived through tribal units, and anthropologists, when they looked back, said they averaged around 175 people. And they survived because they had a tribal band of about 30 individuals of men who went out and gathered food and provide sustenance and safety for the tribal unit. And then over time, these tribal units have moved throughout the world. I mean, they came into the Western Hemisphere, I think, through the Aleutian Islands sort of connection with Europe. I think that's my understanding of that. And then populated basically North America and South America. It's amazing. It went down the west coast of North America and the south coast and goes back a very long period of time. And so then as modern history began, we began thinking about how we live together in larger groups. Interestingly enough, the first origins of a participatory common society in recorded time is sort of, I look at as the advent of the Magna Carta in Great Britain, in what, 1215, I mean, it's just 1,000 years ago, that some sort of written basis for living actually began to evolve. And the Romans had their system of laws that they had put together back in the first, 2nd century. I mean, I don't know how long it goes back. Do you remember how long it goes back, Jim? Anyway, they had this elaborate set of written laws when they were out conquering the Holy Roman Empire initially. They had a uniform sort of legal process for adjudication of how societies function. Anyway, and then, of course, our own time in the people who came here from beginning initially from the Norsemen and from the Nordic countries way before 1492, although they didn't colonize the North America steadily until the settlers originally came from Europe, and had there's a compact that they wrote during the arrival here. So, and then the final people who came together to develop our nation were incredibly gifted people. I mean, these were all people who could read and write Greek and Latin. I mean, if you wrote, anybody read the John Adams book that was taken from all of the letters that he and his wife wrote back and forth to each other. It's a wonderful book about the times when our Constitution was put together, and the philosophical Rousseau and let's see, what are the names that I've written down here? Well, Locke and our own person here in the United States. Well, anyway. So, and people survived in our country by working together, and particularly in communities, to deal with adversities. And a lot of this was documented by Alexis de Tocqueville, who's a Frenchman who came from the United States and toured the United States back in early 1830s and wrote actually a couple of volumes to document sort of the ethnographic character of how we operated. And then we've gone through these painful eras of slavery and suffrage, and as you may recall, the initial electors in the United States were actually the landed. You had to own property to be able to vote, and of course women didn't vote, and there weren't any slaves that voted at that time. And it's only been over a period of time that we've really come to grips with what we started out with, and you must remember that slavery has been going on for centuries. I mean, it's unbelievable adversity that people have encountered over the years, and our expression of it was equally terrible in all sorts of ways. So, and it's only actually during World War II that this all began to really unravel substantially, mainly because the men left, virtually all the men left, and the workings of our society basically undertaken by women. In fact, we had women's sports leagues to honor our national pastimes. And so after World War II, there was this huge exuberance of our society as our growth rate from fertility expanded dramatically. But with the increasing participation of women in the workforce, the underlying and the increasing social mobility of people and movement around the country, some of the traditions that maintained our families, extended families and community networks, really began to not serve us well. And so that as people grew up the first few years of life, the connections between members of family to moderate the developmental needs that everyone has in those situations really began to disappear, so that the changes in employment and localized segregation that used to plague all sorts of communities in different ways now has come back to haunt us with sort of destruction of traditions within how families function and come together. So that's my view of the humanitarian sequence. And of course, the scientific background of health, up until 1800s, about the only medicine that worked reliably was narcotics. And then some of the early findings of immunizations, I mean, they noticed that women who milked cows didn't get smallpox. And so and the reason for that, they thought, was the fact that there was a type of smallpox that would infect cows called cowpox. And if they took some of these lesions from cows and sort of pricked the skin with one of these lesions on top of it, they developed immunity against smallpox. And so the first immunization processes occurred in the late 1700s for that, actually. And the technology of healthcare began to explode slowly but surely. The stethoscope was invented in 1812, of all that things. And it's kind of strange that the most valuable tool for evaluating breathing is still the stethoscope. And we don't really have good tests to evaluate how breathing function is really occurring. I mean, we have lots of things we can measure, especially oxygen levels in the blood, but whether or not those measurements reliably connect with treatment strategies that preserve people's breathing health doesn't really exist. So it's kind of interesting how there's this niche. And of all the chronic illnesses, the only one that hasn't lended itself to improvement over the years is chronic lung disease. And this, of course, goes back to the fact that if you didn't die from injury or malnutrition or wartime, you died from tuberculosis. And that's important to identify, because even after we began to have surgery and from the development of anesthesia and infection control, we still had tuberculosis. And so there was this time back in the early part of the 1900s for the development of sanitariums to provide rest and good nutrition for people to get their tuberculosis under control. And these hospitals were set up in a way so that a court could order you to go to a hospital against your will. And these legal traditions were the basis for our commitment laws these days for the mental health and industry. It's the only other time that commitment laws have occurred is with people with anorexia nervosa, which is just an unbelievably vicious condition that affects so many people. So we have all these technical increases around the turn of the century. In the 1900s, we began to have certification for hospitals and doctors, sort of licensure and all kinds of evolution of public health, sanitation, and well, all those things. And then the development of immunizations began in the 1700s, I'm sorry, 1940s, with the advent of the diphtheria immunization and tetanus immunizations. And now, right now, most children are exposed to immunization sequence during their childhood, 23 different illnesses. It's really pretty amazing. And it's strange, out of all that, the only immunization we've never developed a very, very good one for was influenza. Never more than about 60% better, which is unlike all the other immunizations, which are virtually 95%. And which is amazing to me as a physician that we have a COVID immunization that's 95%. I mean, it's just amazing. So, but we still have lots of unknowns about COVID. So I would say that our healthcare industry, its main attribute that's a problem for our society, amongst lots of details, is its cost. And in 1990, the proportion of our national economy devoted to healthcare was 5%. And in 1990, it was 18% of the national economy. And that means that relative to our economic activity generally, the cost of healthcare has more than tripled. And we still have remaining inequities of maternal mortality. I mean, the African American population is 3 times more likely to die from with a pregnancy than women of other classes. And actually, even it's interesting, the Latino population actually has a maternal mortality that's lower than white individuals in our society. Really kind of, and so how do we explain that? Just really amazing. So if you look at all the other developed countries of the world, they run around less than 13% of their economies for health. And this is all based on data at the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, which is an OECD, which is an organization headquartered in Europe that uses standard ways of measuring things amongst communities, world population, countries, to measure their economic activity. And so they spend less than 13% of their economies for it, 18%. And for 2019, the difference between 13% and 18% was $1 trillion. It's unbelievable. So anyway, we're at this stage where we've gone through all these scientific improvements. The idea that we're going to do enough science to figure it all out is, let me tell you, with epigenetics, it's a myth. It's not to say we don't need scientific evidence. We do, and we need to apply them carefully. But I think we will need a new awareness about what it's going to take within our social structures and how our neighborhoods function and how we provide for the small networks and major networks that involve our citizens it's interesting that the number of people in the original tribal units, 175, is now known as the Dunbar number. And that's sort of a statistic that people who study networks have arrived at, is the number of people that a person can know and connect with to survive and cope with all the various things that occur. And this has been studied in a variety of ways, but it's a real number. So, and to a certain extent, our neighborhoods are at 175. I don't think that it's all that simple, but that's how we survive in life, is our immediate family, however that might be constituted, our extended family, and how those operate during our lifetimes to deal with all the transitions that we have to cope with during the lifetime. Anyway, that's my discussion, and the book is about how these things all come together in different ways. It does not explain what it is we're going to have to do to fix all that. It just gives some different ideas about ways of thinking about that. And in maybe less than 30 seconds, I'll give you what I think it's going to require. So I think that we're going to have some way to get all the payers and all the providers together to figure out how we're going to pay for universal health insurance, and that and think of this as a way to manage a portion of our national economy devoted to healthcare. So what we have to do is to work together to limit health spending so it's a little bit less than economic growth instead of being a little bit more than economic growth every year. And the knowledge necessary to do that is known. There's a Nobel Prize winner, Eleanor Ostrom, wrote about common pool resources and how you come together to manage a common pool resource. And all the attributes necessary to do that are known. Her Nobel Prize was in 2009. She's written about this since 1990. These are old ideas, folks, and they've been around for a long time. And the best example of that for Nebraska is our collaborative relationship with Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming to maintain the water flow through the Republican River. And that was all eventually managed without federal money, without state money. It was all locally done by collaborative agreement amongst all the people involved to maintain the water flow into Kansas. So these are old ideas. So I think we need to solve the amount of money we spend for healthcare. We need to develop a way, community by community, to figure out how to fix our social cohesion issues, neighborhoods, and communities, and between communities. And we probably need some sort of national organization, probably like sort of like the Cooperative Extension Service for agriculture. You know, our agriculture industry is the most efficient and most effective by a wide margin amongst all the developed countries in the world. And I relate this to the Cooperative Extension Service that was established in 1914, and as a way to organize or to collaborate locally between the educational institutions, schools of agriculture all around the country, and the local farming, urban as well as rural. So, and that this process has to include all the local sources of collaboration to deal with the social determinants of health, which are generationally triggered locally, and their solutions must be locally driven. this does not lend itself to a federal government mandate. That's not to say we don't need the federal government to maybe organize how we might do that, much like the Cooperative Extension Service, but these need to be locally, neighborhood, collaborative processes. And really, to be honest with you, this is already going on in many states around the country, particularly Nebraska. We have one collaborative response group in Omaha that's been functioning for 4 or 5 years. And so it's not like these are new things, folks. We just need to sort of get focused and get it all together. So anyway, that's my song and dance here. And so what I'd like to do is see what questions you have, and we'll just get into a dialogue. And Katie, are you on? Oh, there you are.
I'm here.
So,
and Charlene raised a question in the chat that I'll share with you, in case you can't see it. Prior to 1973, in the passage of the Health Maintenance Act, healthcare entities were not allowed to make a profit. After that, healthcare went to non-profit to a money-making business. How do you think that affects the drastic cost of our healthcare? Which is actually a thing you and I have talked about in a question I have too. I have a lot of friends who have full-time jobs and good paying jobs, and they don't go to the doctor because they can't afford the care, right? So how are we all affected by what Charlene brings up here?
And formulate that question one more time.
So like she said, after the Health Maintenance Act, healthcare entities were not allowed to make profit. After healthcare went from nonprofit to a money-making business. How do you think that affects the cost of our healthcare?
Oh, well, let me say, folks, the amount of fraud, excess profits, good old boy stuff in the healthcare system is rampant. It does not cause $100 or $1 million worth of it. It's a lot. Maybe a couple $100 billion. It's not trivial. But I think that the worst thing that happens in all of this, and I'll tell you my personal, totally biased opinion, the private health insurance plans that are negotiated between the major health systems, almost always university-based health systems for complex healthcare, are negotiated with the private insurance in private. Until just this year, this has never lent itself to any kind of public transparency. So what would happen is that the university has some sort of new research or treatment program they want to institute, and they need a little bit more money, so they up their fees, and so they negotiate with the health insurance providers, and her insurance provider says, gee, we can't afford all that. And the healthcare system, and this has actually occurred locally a couple of years ago, said, well, we're not going to contract with you anymore because we really think our fees are worthwhile. And so they sign off on that, and of course Blue Cross Blue Shield struggled for 6 months or so to fix this, So they all agree to some sort of compromise, but it always increases the reimbursement. And finally, all of the other institutions find out about this, so they demand a certain thing, and guess what? The fees are just now mushroomed. And that drives this more than almost anything else. And just this last year, Congress passed a rule, or some sort of rule was passed that went actually to the Supreme Court, and regarding transparency in these negotiations. And my personal opinion is that this whole process has lent itself to Parkinson's law, which many of you may know is that, as the old adage, interesting story, that work expands to use the resources available. So if you can charge the insurance companies a little bit more every year, guess what? That's what you do. So I think that there is fraud. The Medicare people have a whole unit that just deals with fraud, and it's a lot for Medicare, a huge amount. But I think that the main problem is that the profit motive for healthcare, both providers as well as the insurance industry. I mean, the insurance industry isn't exactly immune to profit making. And I mean, like a little bit more than 51% of the stock for the Think Health clinic here. Do I have it right? Think or what it is? It's down on 70 seconds.
Oh, Think Building.
Yes, right. 51% of their stock in that company is owned by Blue Cross Blue Shield. Oh boy. So anyway, I until we have some way to get everybody together in a collaborative format, such as through collective action to deal with risk management that involves states, communities, health plans. Primary health care should be a driver of that. We won't make much progress in the cost of healthcare. So I'm sorry, I got off the track.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I grew up pretty much in poverty, and my folks were still able to buy an insurance plan that covered things we never lacked for medical care. Then I was a nurse, and things ran pretty good till after, things started really falling apart from my perspective in healthcare and patient care after about 1975 to 79, after the profit making got going. And that's one of the big things that I lay a lot of the.
Well, and of course that occurred mainly as a result of Medicare and Medicaid in '65, and that healthcare systems now had to underwrite healthcare or very inexpensively for people over the age who were not employed and who didn't have retirement accounts, and so and also around 1970. The technology involved in healthcare began to expand dramatically. I was an intern at Harlem Hospital in 1969-70, and for all the admissions, we didn't have after-hours lab in the hospital. The house staff had to do all the blood counts and urine tests, and because we couldn't get them after hours.
I started working in healthcare in 1968.
Okay, you know what it was like.
Yeah.
So burgeoning in around, you're right, about 75, the dollar sign began to dominate, and the way the big hospitals do that is by managing market share, and so if they want to increase their market share in a community, well, they just buy out some hospitals, and so and you don't have to think back very long. We've seen that in our own community.
John, John, I believe it was John, posted a question: who benefits from the private negotiations on insurance, the universities or the insurer?
Well, it's mainly the universities. The insurance do, but there's enough competition amongst insurance people that sure, there was a while where Blue Cross Blue Shield had their own private airplanes to fly around Nebraska. That stopped a couple of years ago, but it was still there. And so there is, it's a toss-up who's profiting the most, but the healthcare systems really abuse the insurance process to they're continually remodeling their hospitals all the time, and they are giant museums. And the first floor is usually a fairly ornate affair. So,
but Paul,
yeah.
Two things. One is there's large endowments of medical schools as well as universities. You mean a large portion of this money is coming from insurance companies?
You mean for the endowments?
Or from the things that the endowment usually are spent for?
Well, I think the endowments are mainly not from profits. They're not fed by profits in the healthcare industry. This is what I know.
They're donations from private foundations and corporations and individuals.
Yeah.
All of them.
I agree. And then you might say, well, then why should the universities negotiate with insurance companies that way?
Right.
And I think because it's there. And I would say personally, it's the most aggravating thing about the whole situation.
Harmon asked a question about how do we improve outcomes?
That's a really good question. I think we have to deal with the social determinants of health. I mean, people's susceptibility to illness of all kinds, if they grow up day in and day out worrying about whether they have food for themselves or their children, and how many gunshots are going on down the street in their neighborhood, they can't get sleep. And if you don't have sleep, your mind is not going to work very good. So until we have means to provide safety for people and opportunities, however that might be managed, to have access to social mobility, and that we have ways within communities cooperating with our surrounding communities to develop social cohesion. We have a long ways to go.
That was one of the things that I was going to bring up too, is like, because I remember when I was doing my CPE residency thing, at Emmanuel, I saw the way that like patients who were not white were treated differently, right? Like I attended this, there was a fetal demise, which is not the thing you want to encounter as a chaplain or anybody really. And the woman, she was at 38 weeks. She'd come in earlier that day because she was having some random pain. They did scans. They were like, everything looks fine. She came in later that evening because it was getting much worse. And they tried to do an emergency C-section because of something. And so anyway, but it was a woman of color and she came in with pain and was kind of, dismissed and sent home. And I've always wondered if that would have looked different if she was not a woman of color. I have a friend who passed away 6 months after giving birth, in a similar situation with pain that wasn't taken seriously. And so that to me, there is a lot about our healthcare system that is rooted, like you said, around economic disparities, but also like racial biases and racial tensions. And those are the things that I don't know how we fix, until we fix them in the society at large.
Well, the early stages of life, during pregnancy, prior to birth, and during the first 3 years are critical. We probably won't get at that until we fix the cost of healthcare, period. We need, with our society the way it is and how families need 2 workers in a family to survive, we need the money to provide for family leave during the first couple of years of life, and for better early childhood education. I mean, the countries that have systematic family leave and dedicated early childhood education just generally do better in terms of longevity. And there are statistics about that longevity issue, and it's incredibly powerful. I mean, so I get it. So I think that unless we have ways of not only deal with the social inequities that people are exposed to during their lifetime, and that we have family leave, and we're probably not going to get out of this situation of people growing up in adversities and no way to get out of it because they're so harmed during that time to survive adolescence. So we are really trapped in this situation, and it is a very, very difficult problem.
Is it likely, Paul, that we're going to be able to solve this problem without economic integration of our neighborhoods? I mean, the resistance in wealthy parts of Omaha and other cities to having low-income people, Section 8 housing or other kinds of affordable housing built in that neighborhood is just tremendous. And it sounds like from what you're saying, that's the central issue.
It is. And this is a very difficult problem. I just think we have to focus on early childhood education and the kind of family unity that goes on, and all the dimensions of our society that feeds that. And so, and the traditions of these things are unique community by community. So let me just think about Nebraska a little bit. You know, I calculated a couple of weeks ago our COVID mortality for Nebraska and nationally. And our COVID mortality year to date, just a week or two ago, is 40% less than the national average, nationwide. And basically this hasn't changed. I did this last fall. Basically this connection hasn't changed. And so you might think, well, why is that? Well, you know, we don't have near the population density that many places have, and you know, on and on and on. But 40% is a lot. And I just happen to think that the traditions of our state are so unique that in ways that we don't even know about, like for instance, the idea of education past 8th grade as a cultural norm originated in the territory of Kansas, Nebraska. You may remember historically, the Kansas-Nebraska territory was all one. And so historically, the prevalence amongst communities that had high school education for all students began in Nebraska and Kansas. And you might say, well, hard to see how that would flow to this era, but I'm just saying the things that generate healthy families and healthy neighborhoods to live in that situation, I think has to be looked at and systematically dealt with community by community, and to deal with the origins of that, and to redress all the redlining that was going on in Omaha for years, that people couldn't actually get housing because they couldn't get loans to provide for it.
And we keep defunding our schools. I mean, we keep decreasing the funding to our schools statewide, and that's going to exacerbate the problem.
Absolutely. But if the state wasn't paying $3,000 extra for everybody's health care that's employed by state government and is in jails or on and on and on, Medicaid, there would be money available. But we're spending for the state probably, I don't know, at least for Omaha, the excess healthcare costs for just in the city of Omaha for everyone is probably around $2 billion a year. That's a lot of money for a city. So we have to fix healthcare for all these other things to occur, and the things that are known to do that exist and have been proven by all kinds of studies. I mean, this is not something that's just somebody's whim. What makes collective action work for managing a common pool of resource. I'm sorry, I went on too long. Another question.
We have Judy's question, and then I think we're nearing an hour here, so we're nearing the end of our time. So Judy's question, redlining aside, how do we keep wealthier tribes or localities from claiming resources they don't need just because it's there and they feel entitled to be better?
Institutional social responsibility gets discussed a lot, but largely ignored. I think that what we see in institutions that are institutions that is really devastating is the level of codependency that it goes on between. I mean, basically we have the payers and the providers of healthcare that are in a codependent institutional connection. And as a result of that, neither one of them has the capacity to act in the best interest of the common good. And this goes on throughout society. I mean, you just see it in almost all of our institutional structures. And that's an issue that is in the great unknowns. I mean, we have to have some ways of managing our institutions so that their sense of social stability and connection with the common good is something that we can all depend on. We certainly don't have it now.
Hey, I want to know where and when can we buy your book?
Oh, my great achievement yesterday is that I became a legitimate Amazon seller. And you can't imagine the rigmarole that's involved. I mean, so anyway, I think probably the first printing will be probably sometime in a couple of weeks. And so I think somewhere around April 4th, it'll be available on Amazon.
Happy Easter.
Well, we'll see. But thank you for the question. It'll be interesting to see. I'm anticipating not much of a sell. I think this idea is highly idealistic, and the likelihood that it will sell a lot is probably foregone. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see how it was. And I think if you read it, I'll have to admit, the first couple of chapters are kind of slow going because I've written it particularly with the healthcare system itself in mind. And I'm not too sure that it'll achieve that goal, but I think our greatest hope for healthcare is that the healthcare system gets its act together to have a greater connection of social responsibility. And right now, that doesn't seem to exist. So if you buy it, and I take great pride in in the level people have expressed. It's amazing. So, but just even though some of it seems difficult to sort of keep in mind, that I've written it hopefully not to make it. If you just keep on going through it and don't worry about trying to understand it all as you go through it, you eventually get to the end of it and probably understand how there's just a lot of things that fit together that have conspired to cause a national disaster. So,
What's the book title?
Better Health for America.
The cover is the image I used on the Facebook post.
And there's a little byline below. It says, configuring our nation's population health and its iconic healthcare. So I see our population health as a different issue than the healthcare system, although obviously they're intertwined, and that we have to do things as a nation to deal with them potentially independently to get it really fixed in the long run.
Yeah, as we do all these forums and talk about things, particularly I think during the pandemic, which has stripped away a lot of stuff, so we have to look at all the things. It just baffles me, not baffles me, but it interests me how they're all so very connected to one another. Like one problem that we all know about is always there's always a route to get to that problem from there that is a difficult connection. Paul, do you have concluding thoughts for us?
Well, yes. I have a piece I'm going to read. And this is written by, I don't know, some of you remember a person by the name of Robert Fulghum. That ring a bell to anybody? So he published a book a long time ago entitled All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kinder. So anyway, this is in his introduction. I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts, that hope always triumphs over experience, that laughter is the only cure for grief, and I believe that love is stronger than death.
Nicely done.
So dig it.
We need to keep struggling to how we take care of each other.
Thank you, Paul. Applause. This is the, thank you. I'm going to hit stop here.